I've got it, Victoria Lane huffed, arms wrapped tightly around a towering stack of clean white towels, her sneakers squeaking against the marble hallway floor. Looks like those towels might win if you take one more step. The deep, amused voice made her jump, so did the sight of the man standing in front of her in a tailored navy shirt and dark slacks, sleeves rolled casually to his elbows, eyes a sharp steel blue that caught everything. She blinked. Mr. Zanders, Roman Zanders, the owner of the mansion she worked in, as in the actual millionaire. As in the man who could probably buy the entire block her run-down apartment sat on and not flinch. He stepped forward without hesitation, plucking half the towels from her arms with a quiet kind of authority. "You shouldn't be carrying all of this by yourself." "I can handle it," she said quickly, heat rushing to her cheeks. "I can see that," he said, dryly amused. "But I've got 2 hands and 0 meetings for the next 10 minutes. Humor me." Victoria bit her tongue. She'd been working at the Zanders estate for only 3 weeks, hired through a staffing agency after a string of bad luck and worse jobs. She didn't want to cause waves, especially not with the man whose suits probably cost more than her rent. Still, she followed him through the hallway, trying to focus on the weight of the towels instead of the way his broad shoulders moved as he walked. He held the laundry room door open for her, like he wasn't the most powerful man in the house. Like he wasn't the Roman Zanders, the tech investor who built and sold 2 companies before 35 and now ran a luxury development firm like it was a game he'd already won. She stacked the towels on the shelf. He set his down beside hers and leaned against the counter, watching her with a curious tilt of his head. "I don't think we've officially met," he said. "I'm Roman." "I know," she said before she could stop herself, then winced. "Sorry, I mean yes." "I'm Victoria Lane." "Victoria," he repeated like he was testing the sound. "You're new, from the agency?" She nodded. "Yes, just a few weeks. You like it here?" She hesitated. "It's cleaner than most places I've worked," he laughed, and it was a low, easy sound that did something ridiculous to her chest. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said. "Let me know if anything needs improving." She gave him a small smile, then turned to tidy the shelf. She didn't look back until the door clicked shut behind him. Victoria didn't expect to see him again that week, but Roman Zanders had a way of showing up in unexpected places. The next time was in the garden, when she was hauling a watering can that had clearly been designed by someone who hated her arms. "Didn't we just have this conversation?" he said, appearing beside her and taking the can before she could argue. "You have a habit of carrying things twice your size. It builds character," she said, trying to joke. Even though her heart was racing again, he glanced at her sideways. "You already seem to have plenty of that." She didn't know what to say to that. But he stayed, helping her water plants in his $1,000 shoes like it was the most normal thing in the world. By the 3rd week, she caught herself looking for him, and he kept finding her in the hallway. In the kitchen. Once, when she was dusting the library, he surprised her by sitting down and asking about her favorite book. "No one's ever asked me that," she admitted, halfway through wiping the shelves. "Then I'm honored to be first," he said, watching her with that calm, unreadable gaze. She told him, and they ended up talking for over an hour. The house was always buzzing with staff, guests, and Roman's high-powered world, but when he spoke to her, it felt like she was the only person in the room. Still, she knew better. Men like him didn't look at women like her. Maids didn't end up with millionaires outside of fairy tales or cheap romance movies, so when he invited her to dinner, she nearly dropped a tray of glasses. "You want me to what? Join me for dinner," he said simply, leaning against the kitchen counter while she tried to remember how to breathe. "Just you, not staff, not business, just you." Her first instinct was to say no, but something in his voice, something quiet and sincere, cracked past her defenses. "I don't have anything to wear," she said finally, trying to hide how fast her heart was beating. His lips twitched. "I'll take care of that." 2 nights later, Victoria stood outside the private dining room in a deep sapphire dress that fit like it had been made for her, probably because it had. There'd been no price tag, no explanation, just a note with her name and a velvet box holding a pair of crystal earrings. She nearly turned around twice. But then the door opened, and Roman stood there in a black suit, looking at her like she was the most stunning thing he'd ever seen. "You came," he said softly. "I still have time to run." He stepped closer. "Don't." Dinner was candlelit, the kind usually reserved for anniversaries or proposals. They didn't talk about work. They didn't talk about money. They talked about music, childhood memories, what scared them, what made them feel alive. And when dessert came, she realized he was looking at her the way she'd wanted someone to look at her whole life. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you," he said, voice low. She swallowed. "You've met a million people." "Exactly." After dinner, he walked her down the quiet hallway, hand brushing against hers. She stopped at the corner, not sure what came next. He turned to face her. "Victoria, I know this is complicated. I didn't plan this. But you make me feel like I can breathe again." She couldn't speak. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "I just needed you to know." She stared up at him, heart pounding, and then, before she could stop herself, she stood on her toes and kissed him. It was soft and slow, and everything inside her unraveled the second his hands cupped her face like she was precious. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't see this coming," he whispered. "Neither did I." She hadn't planned to fall for him. But somewhere between the laundry and the laughter, she had. Victoria didn't sleep the night after their kiss. She lay in bed with the covers pulled to her chin, staring at the ceiling of her tiny room tucked in the east wing of the estate. Her thoughts churned with every second of that candle-lit dinner, the way Roman's voice softened when he said her name, how his hands had held her like they didn't belong anywhere else. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a turning point. But by morning, reality crept back in through the cracks. She didn't have time to dwell. The estate was hosting a private event that evening, and the entire staff was already moving at double speed. Victoria found herself assigned to preparations in the drawing room, arranging floral centerpieces brought in from a boutique florist in the city. "Use the white orchids," Mrs. Callahan, the estate coordinator, instructed crisply. "Mr. Zanders prefers them for evening receptions." Victoria nodded, gently replacing the blush peonies she'd just finished arranging. Roman hadn't appeared all day. Not during morning rounds, not during the brief staff meeting by the kitchen. She told herself it didn't mean anything. He was busy. He had a company to run, guests to greet, decisions that didn't involve her, but still something in her chest tightened. By the time the sun dipped low, and the chandeliers were blazing with golden light, the estate had transformed into something out of a dream. Waitstaff in black and white moved through the grand halls. Soft piano music drifted from the ballroom, and guests in designer gowns and tailored suits clinked crystal glasses like it was second nature. Victoria was stationed near the main entrance, quietly directing arrivals toward the reception hall. She kept her head down, conscious of every detail of her uniform, every strand of hair tucked back. She didn't belong with these people, and she knew it. But then Roman walked in. He wore a charcoal suit with a silver tie, his jaw freshly shaven, his eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. When he spotted her, he paused and something in his expression shifted. He didn't approach. Not with a crowd of guests watching, but his gaze lingered. Just long enough to make her pulse jump. Later that night, while refilling a tray of champagne flutes in the butler's pantry, she heard footsteps behind her. "You disappeared," Roman said quietly. "I was working," she replied without turning. "That's what I'm here for, remember." He didn't respond right away. When she finally turned, he was studying her in that way he did when he was trying to read something unspoken. "I didn't want to make anything harder for you," he said, "or risk your job. That's why I didn't say anything earlier." "I understand," she said, though her voice betrayed her. He stepped closer, his tone lower. "I haven't stopped thinking about you since that night." She looked up at him, heart thudding. "Roman, this is your world. I serve drinks in it. You think I care about that?" His voice sharpened slightly, like it offended him. I've spent years surrounded by people who only see my name, my money, my company. You look at me like I'm real." She looked away. "And you look at me like I'm not supposed to be here. That's not true." She shook her head, brushing past him as more glasses needed to be replaced. "You don't have to explain, Roman. I'm not asking for anything." He caught her wrist gently. "But what if I want to give it?" Their eyes met. Before she could answer, a voice called from down the hall. "Victoria, we need you in the west parlor." She blinked, the moment snapping like a branch underfoot. "I have to go," she said, pulling her hand away. Roman let her leave without another word. The next day the house was quiet again. The party had ended, the guests were gone, and the staff returned to routine. Victoria kept her head down, scrubbing out the breakfast room with a cloth and a bucket of lemon-scented water. She didn't expect Roman to find her there. "You're avoiding me," he said, stepping inside. "I'm doing my job." He didn't move closer. "You think this ends with a kiss and silence, that I'm the kind of man who walks away from something that matters?" She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "I think you've lived in a world full of guarantees. I haven't. And I can't afford to get hurt by someone who doesn't know how far a fall this would be for me." "I know exactly how far," he said, "and that's why I'm standing here." She finally looked up. "Why are you really doing this?" "Because I see you," he said, voice steady. "Not just the girl who carries towels or arranges orchids. I see the way you listen when no one's talking to you, how you don't flinch when people overlook you. You're stronger than you think, Victoria." She wiped her hands on her apron, unsure what to say to that. "I have meetings in London next week," he continued. 3 days, come with me." Her eyes widened. "What? Not as staff, as my guest, no pressure, no expectations, just time away from this place, from these lines we keep dancing around." She hesitated. "Is this real?" Roman reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope. "Your flight's already booked. If you change your mind, I'll understand. But if you don't." He set the envelope on the table and walked out. She stared at it for a long time before finally picking it up. Inside was a boarding pass. First class. Departure listed for Friday morning. Victoria didn't sleep that night either. But this time, it wasn't fear keeping her awake, it was the quiet, burning possibility that maybe, just maybe, her story was about to change. Victoria had never been on a plane before, let alone one with crystal light fixtures and leather seats that reclined into beds. She sat stiffly beside a window, fingers tangled in her lap as the flight attendant offered her a menu printed on thick cardstock and addressed her by name. Roman sat across the aisle, flipping through a folder of papers. Occasionally, he glanced over as if checking she was still there. She didn't know what to do with that kind of attention, quiet, steady, and entirely unforced. "You don't have to pretend you're comfortable," he said, laying the folder aside. "I know this isn't familiar." "I'm trying not to breathe too loud," she admitted. "I'm half convinced someone's going to walk in and tell me I boarded the wrong flight." His expression shifted, not with pity but something warmer. "You're here because I wanted you here. That's not going to change." She didn't answer. The words felt too big, too close to something she wasn't ready to name. When they landed, a black Bentley was waiting for them on the tarmac. Victoria followed Roman into the car, trying not to gape at the way the driver greeted him by name, the way the doors closed with a whisper instead of a thud. The hotel towered over the city like a monument to wealth and silence. Their suite, yes, their suite looked like it belonged in a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows, velvet drapes, a marble fireplace flickering with soft light even though the room was already warm. "I had them stock the kitchen with tea," he said as she wandered uncertainly through the sitting room. "You mentioned once that coffee gives you headaches." She turned, startled. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything you say." She lowered her eyes, heat crawling up the back of her neck. The next morning he left early for meetings, promising to be back by evening. She spent the day walking the city with a map the concierge had printed for her. No one stared at her. No one knew she was just a maid from a staffing agency. She was just another woman in a borrowed coat, watching the world move. By the time she returned to the suite, her feet ached and her thoughts were a tangle of emotion. Roman was already there, standing by the window with his tie loosened, sleeves rolled back to his forearms. "Good day," he asked. "I got lost twice," she said, kicking off her shoes. "I also bought a pastry from a street vendor, and I'm 90% sure it had something illegal in it." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Should I call the hotel doctor?" "Only if I start seeing double." She crossed toward the couch and dropped onto it, sighing deeply. Roman sat beside her, close enough she could feel the heat of him. "I've been thinking about something," he said, quieter now. She turned her head. "What?" "I haven't told anyone you're here." Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, no one in my company knows, not my assistant. Not my board, not my family, and that's not because I'm ashamed of you." She waited for the rest, barely breathing. "It's because I didn't want them shaping this, us. I wanted something that was just ours." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything at all. He leaned back, watching the ceiling. "My parents divorced when I was 11. The only thing they fought over was who had to take me on holidays. After that, I stopped expecting permanence from people." Her voice was soft. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm tired of that version of me. The one who keeps everything surface deep. You make me want to start over, to get it right." She felt something sharp and unfamiliar twist behind her ribs. "Roman, this thing between us, it's not normal. It started in a house where I change sheets and you host CEOs. I know what it looks like," he said, "but I also know what it feels like, and I've never felt like this before." She stood abruptly, crossing to the window. Rain had begun to streak the glass outside, soft and steady. "I don't want to be a secret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He joined her, standing behind her but not touching. "Then you won't be," she turned. "Don't say that unless you mean it." "I do." She searched his face. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. "I've been offered a role on the advisory board of a firm in Paris," he said suddenly. "It's long-term and they want me to relocate." Her stomach dropped. "So this was a farewell trip?" "No," he said. "It was a test, for me, to see if I could imagine that future and not picture you in it." "And I couldn't." She stared at him, stunned. "I want you to come with me," he said, stepping closer. "Not as someone in the background, not as someone I'm hiding. I want you beside me." Her throat tightened. "That's a lot to ask, I know." She looked away, heart pounding. "What if people talk? Let them. What if I'm not strong enough for your world? You've already survived more than anyone I know." She blinked back, something sharp behind her eyes. "I've spent most of my life trying to stay invisible. Now you're asking me to stand in a spotlight I didn't ask for." "I'm not asking you to change," he said. "I'm asking you to let me stand beside you in it." She turned back to the window, watching the city blur behind the rain. "I need time," she said finally. He nodded. "I can give you that." But when she glanced back at him, there was something fragile in his eyes, a flicker of hope wrapped in fear, and for the first time she let herself imagine it. A life beyond the estate. A future not built on borrowed hours and hidden moments. Her hand found his and she held it tightly, not with certainty but with something far more dangerous, possibility. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky outside their suite remained layered in soft, overcast gray. Victoria stood barefoot on the balcony, a cup of Earl Grey warming her hands, watching the London streets wake slowly below. The city buzzed in the distance, but here, suspended high above it all, everything felt impossibly still. Behind her, Roman's voice broke the quiet. "I canceled my afternoon meeting." She turned. "Why?" He leaned against the doorframe, hands tucked into the pockets of a slate-colored sweater she hadn't seen before. "Because I realized I didn't come here to negotiate a contract. I came here hoping you'd say yes." "I haven't answered you," she said carefully. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm still here." She set down her cup and crossed the room slowly. "You're asking me to change everything?" "I am." He didn't try to soften it. "And if I say no?" His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Then I'll still go to Paris, but I'll go knowing I left something behind I shouldn't have." She studied him, this man who had once been a distant name printed on crisp white envelopes and whispered about in staff kitchens. He'd become something else entirely, something far more dangerous, real. She stepped closer. "You said you didn't tell anyone about me. I didn't?" "Then tell them," she said. "Start now." His brows lifted slightly. "Are you saying I'll come with you?" she interrupted. "But not if I'm going to be your secret." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I want you front and center." "I want my own place," she added quickly. He smiled, this time with something steadier behind it. "Done. And I want to earn my own way. I don't want to be just the girl you flew in and dressed up. You deserve to be more than anything I could give you," he said, "but I'll never stop trying." Later that day, they boarded a train to Paris. Victoria sat by the window, watching the countryside roll past in streaks of green and gold. Roman sat beside her, reading through documents, but his hand never left hers. It wasn't possessive, it was grounding. A promise, quiet and unshakable. Their arrival was quiet, no photographers, no attention. Just a driver waiting with her name printed on a placard and an apartment key in a velvet-lined box. "This is yours," Roman said, handing it to her as they stood in front of a tall building tucked between a bookstore and a florist. "Short-term lease, long enough to settle in. Furnished, but if you hate the couch, I'll burn it." She laughed despite herself. "You're serious?" "Completely." The apartment was small by his standards, but to Victoria it was a palace. High ceilings, sun-washed walls, and a view of the Seine through narrow windows. A vase of fresh tulips stood on the table. "I told them you liked simple things," Roman said, closing the door behind them. She turned slowly in the center of the room, drinking it in. "It's perfect." He leaned against the wall, watching her. "You haven't asked what this makes us." She met his gaze. "Are we supposed to name it already?" "I'd like to." "Why?" "Because I've never wanted to call anyone mine before." She walked to him, resting her hands on his chest. "Then say it. You're mine," he said, voice low. "And I'm yours if you'll have me." She kissed him before he could say more. Over the next few weeks, their lives folded together like silk. He introduced her to his colleagues as his partner, his tone never wavering. He invited her to a gallery opening, and when she hesitated at the thought of walking in beside him, he offered his arm and whispered, "They'll be lucky to know you." She started volunteering at a local library, helping with literacy programs. It gave her something of her own, something that reminded her she was still herself. Even in Dior heels, Roman insisted she wear just once before letting her go back to her flats. They fought, sometimes. She hated how often he checked his phone during dinner. He called her out when she tried to solve problems alone instead of asking for help, but the arguments never lasted long. They learned each other's rhythms, like dancers who had finally found the right partner. One evening, weeks later, Roman took her to a rooftop overlooking the city. A string quartet played softly in the background, and the table was set for two with gold-rimmed plates and crystal glasses that caught the last light of the setting sun. She narrowed her eyes as she sat. "This isn't just dinner." He gave her a crooked smile. "No." "It's not." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black box. When he opened it, the ring inside caught the light like a promise. "I don't want to wait anymore," he said. "I've built empires. But none of them meant a thing until you walked into that hallway with an armful of towels and didn't flinch when I offered to help." Her throat tightened. "I don't care where we get married or how, just say yes," he said. "Let me spend the rest of my life proving this isn't a dream, it's real." "You're real, we are." She could barely breathe. "I never wanted this, I know. I didn't think I deserved it." "You do." She looked down at the ring, then back at him. "You're sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything." She nodded once and then again, the tears spilling before she could stop them. "Then yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, then stood and kissed her until the city disappeared behind the blur of her joy. They married a month later in a sunlit courtyard in Provence. No press, no shareholders, just them and a handful of people who mattered. She wore a dress she picked herself. He cried when she walked down the aisle. After the ceremony, Roman stood beside her, holding her hand like he never meant to let go. "You changed everything," he said softly. She leaned in. "You helped me carry towels." He laughed then freely, fully, and kissed her again while the world clapped and the sky bloomed with light. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the Paris apartment as Victoria adjusted the strap of her handbag and checked the time. Roman had left early that morning for a final meeting related to his advisory role. But tonight, they were attending their first formal event as a married couple, an exclusive benefit gala hosted at the Palais de Tokyo. She'd spent the afternoon at a fitting with a stylist Roman had introduced her to after the wedding, someone who insisted she try colors she'd never worn before. The result was a deep emerald silk gown that swept the floor and caught the light with every movement, paired with a delicate gold cuff designed by a local artisan. When Roman returned, he paused in the doorway, his tie undone, umbrella in hand, his expression briefly unreadable. "You're going to steal the entire evening," he said finally. She turned, brushing a hand over the fabric at her hip. "You think this is enough to walk into a room full of people who think I don't belong there?" He stepped forward, setting the umbrella aside. "They'll see what I see." "A woman who doesn't need to prove anything." She looked up at him. "You ready for people to start asking questions?" "They already have," he said. "And I've answered every one." The gala shimmered with low light and quiet wealth. Crystals hung from the ceiling like stars, and every table was marked with the name of a donor or dignitary. As they entered, a few heads turned and a hush fell briefly, like the sound of a breath being held. Roman didn't hesitate. He placed his hand on the small of her back and guided her through the crowd, nodding to a few familiar faces. He introduced her to a diplomat from Geneva, a fashion executive from Milan, and a composer whose work had scored 3 major films. Unlike before, she didn't shrink. When a woman with sharp red lipstick and a last name that belonged on magazine covers leaned in and asked, "And how did you two meet?" Victoria didn't flinch. "I was working," she said, and he didn't look away. That was the only answer anyone received, and it was enough. Later, after speeches and dancing and far too much champagne, they returned to the apartment. Roman loosened his tie, kicked off his shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed, watching her remove a pair of earrings. "You didn't just survive that," he said. "You owned it." "I was terrified," she admitted, unzipping the side of her dress. He leaned back on his elbows. "You didn't look it." "I kept thinking someone would pull me aside and ask to see credentials." His expression softened. "You're not an employee here, Victoria. You're the reason I've stopped looking for more." She turned and crossed to him, standing between his knees. "You still planning to take that board seat full-time?" "They offered a permanent position. I told them I had to check with someone first." She tilted her head. "Me," he nodded. "You're my life now. I don't make decisions without you." She brushed his hair back from his forehead. "Then let's make one together." They chose to stay. Paris became home in more ways than one. Victoria found a job at a literacy nonprofit, eventually taking on a leadership role. Roman transitioned into a part-time strategic position, granting him more freedom than he'd ever allowed himself before. They rented a second apartment near the Sorbonne, small, sunlit, full of plants and books and mismatched mugs. Sometimes they stayed there on weekends, just the two of them, pretending they were students again, making crepes in their socks and arguing over music. One Friday evening, Victoria stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her teeth when Roman appeared in the doorway, holding a small white envelope. His expression was unreadable. "What's that?" she asked. He held it out. "Mail from your old staffing agency." She took it, frowning as she opened the flap. Inside was a printed invitation, an annual alumni dinner for past employees who had gone on to start businesses, nonprofits, or become leaders in their fields. She laughed. "I think they sent this by mistake." He shook his head. "You belong on that list." "No, I was a maid. I didn't." Victoria. He crossed to her, gently taking the envelope from her hand. "You changed the direction of my entire life." You walked into a place where people are invisible and made yourself unforgettable. She looked at him, her eyes suddenly stinging. You really believe that? I fell in love with you before you even knew I'd noticed. She reached for his hand. Then let's go to the dinner. He raised an eyebrow. You want to? I want them to see where I ended up. That spring, they did go. The dinner was held in a modest banquet room in London, and as they walked in hand, several of Victoria's former co-workers did double takes. Some smiled. Some looked stunned. One whispered, Is that Roman Zanders? But by then, she didn't need to explain. She wasn't there to prove anything when a young woman fresh out of training asked her quietly, How did you go from there to this? Victoria smiled. I stopped assuming I was meant to stay small. Years passed, and the world kept moving, but they moved with it side by side. Roman never stopped leaving notes on the fridge, and Victoria never stopped stealing the covers. They traveled often, always returning to Paris, always returning to each other. One morning, Roman brought her breakfast in bed and set a small, wrapped box beside the tray. Inside was a key. She looked up. Another apartment, he shook his head. A bookstore. You said once you wanted to open one. She didn't cry. She laughed, the sound full and whole. They opened it 6 months later, tucked on a quiet street near the river. It became a place for stories new, old, borrowed, and rewritten. Just like theirs, their love didn't burn out. It burned steady. And in the city of light, they built something neither of them had ever dared to dream of. Forever.